using a stand-up desk, I am. I love it. I've been using one for 4 years now. Alternative to that is when I sit down, I usually sit on like a yoga ball. But recordings tend to get a little funny, especially with people watching them at like 2.0 speed or 1.5 speed or whatever. Okay, so just a couple of housekeeping items when we, kind of how I like to run my classroom at Lambda School. By the way, I'm Ryan Hamblin. It's good to meet you all. We've seen each other before, possibly during build weeks, or you've seen some of my videos. I used to be on the web team full-time before build weeks became a thing, and that became my full-time job on top of my full-time job. So I transitioned about 3.5 months ago, 4 months ago, full-time over to build weeks. So if you haven't been taught by me, that's why. But yes, I'm excited to be here and talk to you about the React component lifecycle today. Just something that I think if you really truly master, that's kind of what separates you from like just understanding how to use React and working with it to really understanding the intricacies of how it works kind of underneath, and like getting yourself into and out of sticky situations with the component lifecycle methods, but also just really having a fundamental foundational grasp and understanding of how things work. There is a Q&A thread in the chat that I will watch, and I will refer back to every 15-20 minutes or so as we kind of move through the content. Or if I'm asking you questions, I would love it if you put your answers to those questions in that thread so that we don't flood the channel. One question came in about build week voting. If that wasn't posted, I'm sorry. I can work on that this afternoon. Speaking of which, I will be ending class about 10 minutes early today because I have an appointment about 40 minutes away, 35 minutes away from my house that I need to be at lunch 30. So I'm going to try and not get a speeding ticket, but speed up there. But yes, we can do some, we can look at that, the voting form for last week's build week demo. So Dustin filled in for me last week, so I'm filling in for him. It's kind of one of those cycles, one of those life cycles. So let's talk about the component life cycle in React, because it's important to know this stuff, okay? So I'm going to jump in and I'm going to talk first about this React.component base class that you get with the React API. So the React component base class, essentially when you extend your component that you're building and saying, class foo extends, React.component. Has anyone ever given thought as to what they're actually doing with that? What is it that you're actually doing when you extend React.component? What do you get from the React ecosystem when you do that? And you can throw your guesses, your questions in that, or your answers to that in that Q&A thread in chat. You're inheriting functionality. You're getting access to some props, potentially, depending if you have a parent component. You're extending a class that React has set up. That's true. You get some methods. Yep, okay. A lot of set state. Okay. Yep, we solved it. So what you're actually doing is you're getting access to the React API. So everything that was mentioned there, most of the stuff that was mentioned there, the set state, the lifecycle methods, you're not necessarily passing data yet. That is a mechanism built into classes and kind of how they work and functions in JavaScript in general. But what you are getting is the ability to kind of tap into the React ecosystem and use the API to its benefit. So just right here in the docs, if you're to look up the React.component portion of the docs, you'll see what you get out of the component lifecycle. Okay, so there are 3 actual phases that we're going to talk about today, and we're going to kind of work through a code sandbox that allows us to expose and trigger some of the methods in these phases. Okay, but if you notice, the phases are mounting, updating, and then unmounting. Okay, and then there are within those phases, when you understand the different times in which these methods would potentially be called if they were defined, right? Then you can understand like what's actually going on with your components, right? And understanding that is a key core concept in React application development today. Okay. Now, caveat all of this with the idea that classes are sort of trending away from React, right? And the replacement of classes will be is and will be the future of React. Looks a lot more functional and a lot less object or class oriented. Okay, and hooks, which you already know a little bit about, actually replace a lot of this. In fact, there's one hook to kind of rule them all that comes from the React API now that allows us to sort of do away with component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount, which we're going to talk about those today. But who knows what hook actually replace? Oh, Jonathan already said it. So Jonathan reads my mind and posts his answers before I even say it. Use effect actually is the hook to sort of replace a lot of these things. But I don't want you to think of use effect as tapping into the React component lifecycle. Okay, use effect is sort of like a subscription mechanism to subscribe your functional components to changes or manipulation in state and things like that. So it's kind of like a subscription-based model versus a model that has a life cycle. Okay, so they're different, but it sort of like replaces the old behavior. So truthfully, understanding the React component lifecycle will allow you to sort of see that the power that are behind hooks and understand it a little bit more, because y'all got it easy nowadays. These young kids getting into React, you got it easy because you don't have to learn 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different methods to understand the full life cycle. You just need to understand a few of the new hooks that are built into the API and how to use them. So they're paradigms that are different, but you need to understand like kind of where we come from and where we're at today. And even Dan Abramoff himself has mentioned that. So basically, he's talking about how the anatomy of a component, or the good bits about a component are not elevated by class syntax. It's the two actually solve kind of different problems. And React kind of jumped to classes because they were pretty new at the time that React was being written and worked upon. And so here we are today, where it's like, well, maybe some of these old ideas aren't as good as we think, and we could think of different approaches. So anyway, a little bit of a history lesson, a little bit of a reason why, but anytime that you need to refer to any of the documentation to understand the life cycle of a component, the React documentation is one of the best places to go to for that. And so if you want to do a deeper dive later today, while you're warming up ramen and macaroni and cheese or something for lunch, go ahead and sit down and dive through the docs and get a little bit geeky with it. And I will reference back to them throughout the day. But I want to start by drawing our attention to this this image here, because it really breaks down the current state of the life cycle in React components, class components, that is. So the first phase in a React component lifecycle, you can think of it as this like the birth of your component. Anytime that it gets drawn onto the screen, it gets mounted as some sort of DOM element onto the screen. That is what's called the mounting phase. So notice they're all ing, mounting, updating, and unmounting. Okay, they don't, when you are mounted, you're mounted, right? Your component has done all the things that it needs to do. It's on the screen. The user can interact with it. Once the user interacts with it, then it is updated. And then once it is no longer on the screen, it is unmounted, right? But the phases, there's very particular reasoning as to why they put them as mounting, updating, and unmounting in terms of the speech, right? Because when you are mounting a component, you have access to all of these different methods, okay? And the first one, and the one that's probably going to be the most important in terms of state, will be the constructor function. And the constructor function is really good for setting up state. It's the place where you have your initial state that you need to use in that component that needs to be there to determine some sort of deterministic way to figure out what needs to be added to the DOM, right? So if there's a Boolean that says mount this div if it's true, or don't do anything if it's false, like just nullify it, right? Then that would be a good place to put that in that constructor function. And then once you have access to anything on that constructor function, you initialize that state. Once that state changes, your component is aware of it, and the updating phase can begin, right? But all of the initial setup for the state that your component would need, even pre-render, would be in the constructor function, okay? Isn't the constructor function super obsolete with the newest version of JavaScript? That's a very good question. I'm not sure. I would have to research a little bit more of the newest version of JavaScript to know that. In terms of the latest versions of React, I would say no. I would say that it's important to know these things. But yeah, you may know something that I don't know. In fact, that's one of my favorite interview questions when I interview junior employees, is tell me something I don't know about JavaScript. So you may be a good candidate for hire right there, Brett. Okay, so constructor. This is where we would initialize our state. We would add anything that we need pre-render, right? And then get derived state from props. We're not even going to touch this. This is something that was pretty new, in the last, I don't know, call it 18 months. And didn't really receive a ton of adoption, and we're not going to concern ourselves with it too much. But just know that in the lifecycle, it would be concerned in the mounting phase, and then part of it in the updating phase as well, which you can see the render function is another one that's like that. So we'll move right on to the render function. What is the render function? Who wants to give like 3-word sentence, 4-word sentence as to what the render function is and what it does? The render updates the DOM function that renders the virtual DOM. I'd like to unpack that a little bit more because I really enjoy that answer. Okay, yeah, so the render function puts things onto the DOM. Virginia, I love it. Essentially, it's the function that gets called that returns what? What does the render function return? It returns JSX, absolutely. Okay, so all the HTML-looking stuff that's in your JavaScript functions is called JSX, right? And the render function, what it returns will be represented on the DOM at some point. We don't need to get through all of the, the compiler and, the other different parts of the virtual DOM and the engine behind React. Just know that what you return out of the render function is what will be eventually added to the DOM. So I love how we got there. I loved all of your answers to that. So essentially, what happens after the render is there's a function that will eventually get called. And don't worry about React updates DOM and refs. Like, that's something that is happening sort of behind the scenes. The stuff gets painted to the DOM, and then eventually, boom, it's there, it's displayed to the user. What really matters is what the user can see and interact with. So that render method is very important in the lifecycle of your component, okay? And then eventually, at the very end of it all, in the mounting phase, the component did mount function gets called. And it's something that, once that's called, we can safely say that there is actually something to interact with at that point, because render has been called. But what could happen is potentially new data could be received. So let's play around with this. Let's go through the process of sort of adding some, whatchamacallit, some logs to see this kind of come to play. And that's going to kind of be what our lesson is all about today, is just literally playing around with things and building some things together, okay? So I am going to drop you this line in Slack, this URL. So the code sandbox that we're first going to play around with is right here. It's called the component lifecycle start, and you should see a bunch of Pokemon. And I'll let you all pull that open, and we'll get started together. playing around in it. So the first thing that I like to do when I see a new repository or like a new app, the first thing that I love to do is kind of get familiar with the files that I have available to me, right? As any curious investigator or forensics person would do, archaeologist, right? We want to know all the facts about what we're playing at. And so those are good habits for software developers to get into. Know the facts, know what you have, know your tools, know your disposal. And look, Dustin's smiling face is right there for us. I'm going to fork this, so it's my own. And we're going to unpack some of this stuff. So looks like we have some styles, pretty easy sass there. Pokemon component, which is going to, looks like we're console logging some things. So first thing that I see here, ooh, we have a bunch of Pokemon. So this looks like it's our props. In fact, if I see a console log that I don't like, this is in the Pokemon.js file. You don't necessarily have to do this. This is just me being OCD. I am going to say, I'm going to label my console logs. Props in Pokemon. Did I spell that right? Okay, so it looks like we have, ooh, it's logging twice. And then our little warning went away. I wonder why that is. We have a problem. I'm not worried about it, but fragment is defined and never used because of this syntax here. Okay, so this is just literally me discovering these files for, like I looked at them last night, but I just wanted to unpack them today, and it's a good exercise for you to get into the habit of as well. So now we're going to open the app file, and it looks like we actually have class app extends react.component, the constructor method that we were just talking about. We have some state, and we have render, okay? What's interesting about this, do we actually, and I'll ask you, do we actually need to extend the React component at this juncture? Does this need to be a class component? Not until you use state. True. And I guess we are using state to pass it down to Pokemon. Okay. So in this case, we are using state. Now, I want to challenge what Elisa said because we are using the render lifecycle method. So we don't necessarily have to use it, but what's interesting is we are using and relying upon state. And so because of that, we would need to hold local state on our component right here on this state object. And the best place to do that is in the constructor function. Now, the challenge to that is that new age React would not need this syntax, right? Because you would use hooks, and you can have local state with which hook would you use for local state if you didn't have a class component? Use state, exactly. So how do we know when we need a class versus functional component? The answer to that lies solely on, does this component need state? Does it need to hold its own state? And then the next question you would ask yourself is, are there any moments in the lifecycle of this component in which I would actually need to set up and take down event listeners or add some sort of, tweaking the data, right? And at that juncture, you would definitely want to use a class component. So the answer to that question is you ask yourself two questions. Does this component need its own local state? The answer is yes, awesome. Or will I need to use a lifecycle method in the future for this component? So the only way to understand that is to kind of get through what we're learning today and then just have a lot of experience building React components. So at a certain point, if you start, this is my methodology. Every component that I build, I start as a functional component until I need state, right? And remember, this is the React mindset of yesteryear, because hooks changes all of this, okay? Cool, I'll stop for a couple of questions here really quick because it looks like some are coming in. I'm a little confused about where I would put the API call inside of this app. if I were getting the data from an API rather than importing it? That's a very good question, and that's something that we're going to cover ad nauseum today. And the answer has definitely been provided for you by Brett. It is in the component did mount lifecycle method, and you would only know that if you had like read ahead and like really studied up on this. So we're learning that today. So don't feel bad for not knowing that at this point. Now you know it. So all of your data fetching should happen on the component did mount lifecycle method. Okay. How come sometimes my component from React will only work as my component from React? It probably has to do with import-export syntax, Scott, and it's something that we can look into at a different time. But if you notice, we're just importing the default component from React right now, importing the default object from the data file. So if it's not default, you would destructure the object and import it that way. Okay. How do we know when we need to use class versus functional component? Use class. Yep. Okay. Thank you, Vanessa, for paraphrasing me. So that's perfect. Okay. So let's do some diagnostics here, because we are all engineers, right? We're computer scientists, and we need to prove some hypotheses, right? These methods right here that we're going to look into, the constructor, the render, and the component did mount method, we are going to test and put to the test in terms of the mounting phase. And we're going to see what happens, okay? So in app.js, we're going to add a console log inside of our constructor function, okay? So console.log, and follow along with me here. This is the guided project exercise for today. So console log, and we're going to say mounting, so let's say constructor in app.js, just so that we know exactly where it's at. And I'm actually going to delete this so it doesn't trip us up. By the way, if you're really curious about this Pokemon.js file and what these prop type things are, you can go and look at the API for type checking that you can get from the prop types package that used to be a part of the React API, but it's not anymore. Not important for today, just something that you can look at and kind of look at for your future. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add a console log in the render function, and we're going to see when this one runs as well. Render running. Okay. Ooh, check it out. So constructor gets called, and then render is running. For some reason, it's getting called twice. I don't have an answer for why that is right now. It might just be something that Code Sandbox does, or it might be in the construction of this little thing. So we could definitely diagnose that in a little bit. Okay, and then the last console log that we want to run at this point is in the Pokemon.js, and we're going to add it above the actual return. So we did have one already above the return. We're going to add it back in. It was bugging me because I wasn't doing them in sequential order, and now that we're here, so Pokemon render. So this is the Pokemon component, remember. Okay, so this is something that's kind of interesting because there are no lifecycle methods in this component, but we're still calling a function. So of course this will get invoked because we're returning some sort of DOM to the screen. Okay, but at first, if we look at this, constructor is getting called, then render is running, and then Pokemon render runs in that order. Okay, and then for some reason again the process is being repeated. Okay. So inside of this component, we can safely assume that as of now, this is correct, right? The mounting phase, our component is being mounted. This is the order in which things are getting called. Constructor, render, and then our other component is getting mounted and getting rendered as well. Okay, so here's where we're going to get a little bit interesting. We are going to add the component did mount hook, lifecycle hook. People called them hooks before hooks were a thing, so forgive me if my React vernacular is not cut up to the hip new ways. But component did mount will be invoked as a method on this class, okay? And we're just going to simply put for now CDM invoked in app. Okay, now let's look at our diagnostics. Constructor, render, Pokemon render, and CDM invoked in app. Interesting. Why would the function here, this component, why would this be called before component did mount? Who can venture a guess there? And if you don't have it rendering twice in your console, that's amazing. Okay. Yep. Yep. Okay. I have not seen a wrong answer yet. And if you don't have it rendering twice, that's awesome. I do. I don't know why. So if you don't have it running twice, just ignore my second version. Maybe it's an auto thing. I don't know. Okay, yes. So CDM, yeah, it's sandbox console, something weird. CDM is actually going to run at the end of all of this mounting, right? So if we had, you know, and if I were to do this multiple times, let's save that. It could still only happen once at the end of all of the renders. Notice that we rendered 4 Pokemon components all before CDM was invoked, okay? And CDM, component did mount, is the place in which we want to actually fetch data. So if we were to this up and add a couple of notes, well, we can do that. I can do that at the end later and give you the annotated version. So what we can derive here is that did we prove our hypothesis? If this was our hypothesis, did we prove, at least with our code, that this is what's actually happening? Is it safe to say, with the tests that we have run, albeit only a few tests, that we have proven this? Yes, we have gone through and we have done some diagnostics, and it is safe to say that constructor was run first, and then the render method, and then the subsequent render method from the children components, right? Or single child component, in which case it was just the one Pokemon. And then at the very end of it all, the component did mount phase, or the component did mount gets run. So what's really awesome about this is you never, ever, ever in a constructor function want to call this .setState. This is an anti-pattern, and you initialize your state the same way that we've done above here, right? But what we're going to do, actually add an empty array. We're going to break things, okay? Oh, cool. Somebody added a date.now to their console logs. That's great. So the set state after we get our data. So let's pretend now, let's go all the way back to the question that was asked earlier about what do we do with external data? Where do we fetch that data? Where do we get that data and information from? And the answer is in component did mount, okay? So we're gonna pretend like this is data that's being returned from an API. Even though it's local, we know it's in the file, we see it being imported, we're gonna treat it as if it's an API, and we're going to simply set the state with this data from component did mount, okay? And because this is a method on the class component, we don't need to do any funky binding or anything. We get for free access to the this.keyword or the this keyword. So right now, if we were to look at this, it's going to point to our class We're going to look, there's some props, context, ref, there's state. We can look at state. It's an empty array of Pokemon at this point. Okay. And then other stuff that comes from the extension of the base class. So now what we're going to do is we're going to call this dot set state, and we are going to add Pokemon back to our state. And then we're going to take a look at our console. Okay. Something different happened here. Let's go up to the top. Constructor was set up. Our render ran. Pokemon render ran. CDM invoked. Render ran again. Pokemon render ran again. And you don't need to worry about these anymore because that's the repeat. But we just added 2 new steps because the render function was called again and because this function was called again as well. Interesting to think about, right? Why would render be invoked again after component did mount? I thought component did mount was the last thing to be called. And once again, y'all just reading my mind. State changes causes a re-render, and that is the fundamental principle of React, okay? Anytime your state updates, remember this, write it down. Somebody paraphrase this, write it on the wall, make a meme out of it. Anytime your state updates, any of the components that rely on that state will be re-rendered. The render function or the component themselves, which in this case kind of acts just like the render function, will be invoked again. Okay. Carlos said it, probably the best paraphrase, set state leads to re-render. I said probably. All y'all had great paraphrasing. Okay, any questions up to this point? Why do we write this component did mount before render in the component code? Most of that is convention. At this point, it would not matter. As long as they're defined within the app, it doesn't matter where you write them. However, commonly used React patterns, what's funny is we used to do funny things. So if I had like my own method here, I would dress it up in a different way. But commonly used convention is to see lifecycle methods all come before the render function, because the render function is sort of the representation of what's going to be rendered to the screen. So I thought it was because render usually has a return statement. That too, but if I had my own method, some toggle method or something, I would have a return statement there. So that's one case where that wouldn't hold true. But you usually, and there are other component lifecycle methods that do return things. Maybe not. Could have sworn there have been some. Yeah. I mean, you're safe to assume that there's no return in other lifecycle methods. Git snapshot before update, but that's like for testing, and it's not like, yeah, those interesting ones. Getting derived state from props, returns. So it's safer to assume that it's the thing that's going to be represented to the user. That's going to be presented as the thing we're trying to display, right? Somebody memeified it. I should never challenge you to meme my statements. Yeah, but Luis, that's a very good observation. Render definitely always has a return statement, but there are other functions. There are other methods that you could return as well. Okay. All right. This is a lot of information. I want it to sort of sink in for a minute. So let's take a 5-minute breather right now. I like to kind of keep, 3 or 4 breaks throughout my conversations. So go take a 5-minute breather, go grab a drink of water, and then we'll start playing around with some of the other parts of the life cycle. See you in 5. Okay. We are back at it. All right. So it is important to note, I mentioned that we have access for free to this keyword, and it points to the app that we're building here, right? The app class. So what I want to point out is that why do we never just do this? Why do we rely on a function to do this for us when we could just reference the property on the object and just reset it? Who wants to venture a guess? I don't expect any of you to know this, by the way. Why don't we just can't we just change a value? Daniel knows something. Okay. Set state causes the re-render. Absolutely. Okay. So you're all, yeah, state is immutable. What the heck does this mean? Man, y'all are so prepared. Okay. This is so great. So data, the state data that we're worried about in our objects that we use in our React components, we should never treat it as something that we can just mutate willy-nilly, right? We go through set state because it is a mechanism built into the React API that allows us to use an immutability tactic, okay? And you'll learn a lot about that, especially when you get to Redux, when you start talking about state management for your global state structure of your application instead of just the component-based state, okay? You'll start learning about immutability there. You should have known a little bit about it, but yes, immutability. And then the second reason is, of course, because set state triggers a re-render. So you had half of it and then you filled in the other half. So if I were to do this, my component would not re-render, the state would change, my render function wouldn't update. And then what happens in that case? We've gone around the React lifecycle, the React ecosystem, and we've updated the data, but we have not updated the user about the data that has changed. So that's a good thing and a good principle to understand, that we never, ever, ever mutate state directly. Okay, we use the set state function or use state hook. Let's move on to the next part of our little component phase. Okay, so we've seen some updates because we triggered the state, we got to re-render. Okay, and notice that render just happens throughout. So let's look at our life cycle. Okay, so mounting constructor, boom, we got that out of the first one. Constructor gets run. Second, what's the next one that we're using? Render. Okay, render gets called in the parent component and the child component, and then the next one is component did mount. Okay, now what did we do in component did mount? Well, we actually updated the component. And we can prove that because we've moved out of this mounting phase over to a new render phase, over to the updating phase, and we have triggered a render without the constructor or any of the other stuff that we had, right? So we proved that this diagram is what it should be. Now you can add a should component update hook. You can read more about that, but once again, so should component update is a fail-safe. It's like some updates change to our state, but sometimes we don't want to trigger a re-render. So should component update, if that hook is available, if that lifecycle hook, I need to just call them methods. If that lifecycle method is available, then if you can have a Boolean in there that catches, that says, hey, we actually don't want to trigger a re-render, and we can stop the updating phase at that point with should component update. Okay. I don't know why the names are wrong in the Pokemon. I'm sorry. Our data is not cleaned up. You can go and clean up the data and then submit it back to Dustin. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, so does this kind of all start to make sense? We called constructor, we called render in the parent and the child, component did mount, we moved out of mounting at that point, okay? And then we updated the state in which case render happened. If we had should component update and we wanted to stop it from rendering and we said, this is what you're going to do, you're going to stop it, then we could stop the render from happening. Okay. All right. And then we have the get snapshot before update. You can use that for testing, other techniques. React's going to update the DOM. And now we should have access to this little thing called component did update. Let's look in the docs before we get too far into it. Component did update is invoked immediately after updating occurs. This method is not called for the initial render. Interesting. So React is so smart that it knows if it's an initial render or if it's a render that was triggered by what? And then I'll answer Carlos's question. Some event, okay? But what specific set state? There it is, Quentin and Brett. So we set state, we change the state, it triggers a re-render. So React is so smart that it knows if it's an initial render or if it's a render that takes place as a result of a call to the set state function. Okay, unpacking this stuff, folks, is honestly one of my favorite things to do about React. Truly understanding the lifecycle, it just puts so much power in your hands, especially because you will work with code bases. Even if everyone's like, we're adopting hooks no matter what, you will work with a code base that has class components in it, guaranteed. Carlos said to stop a re-render, which is best and why? Should component update versus event.prevent default. So should component update, they're two different things. The event.prevent default that you're using even with React, you're using it on the synthetic event that React puts it, into the API, right? And then it'll trigger that on the global window event, okay? So prevent default just prevents the default behavior for some listener on an HTML element, okay? Should component update will stop the lifecycle of the React component itself and not necessarily affect any of the synthetic or like the virtual or the actual DOM. Okay, so there's a difference there. One is a part of the mechanism that's built into the window object. The other is a part of the mechanism that's built into the React object. Okay, so kind of different, like event dot whatever always has to do with the actual DOM itself or the synthetic DOM, the synthetic event object that comes with the virtual DOM. Okay, I know we're not going to go into those woods, but that's what you can look up if you want to study that further on your own time. And then any of these lifecycle methods just deal with the React components themselves. Great question. So component did update. We're going to use this as an opportunity to operate on the DOM when the component has been updated. It's also a good place to do network requests as long as you compare, so this is a big caveat, compare the current props to the previous props. Example, a network request that may not be necessary if the props have not changed. Okay, and then an example of it, we get previous props, we actually get a second argument from component did update. So this is one of those methods that is different than the others because we get arguments, we get actual, what are those things called? We get, I can't think of the word right now. We get actual things that we can work with here. The variables that you pass. Parameters, thank you. Gosh, dang it. Man, I couldn't think of that word. Knew exactly what it was. Okay, cool. So we actually get access to this parameter that will be served into us as an argument that we can use to do some conditional rendering or some conditional fetching, right? They're giving this as kind of a good example of when you would use that. So we're going to build that now. We're going to play around with this mounting phase, okay? Or this updating phase. So I want everyone to write down component did, and notice like if you have IntelliSense built in, you can just use it right there. And we get what's known as the previous props, previous porps, and previous state as well. And then of course, we're going to console log and say CDU running. Now, if we go back to that example found in the docs, They are checking to see if some thing, in fact, we could literally copy and paste this data. They're checking to see if there is a user ID that does not match, like that's on props itself, that does not match the previous props user ID. So is the user data that I'm interfacing with now the actual user data that I need? And if that condition holds true, right? If this returns true, then we will fetch for some data. So let's do this. Let's actually console.log. And you're probably asking yourself, like, this fetch data function doesn't exist, Ryan. And you're absolutely right. We've never written that. We don't have the fetch data, right? So I'm just going to put in here, never will run, because this condition will never be true for us, right? Now, here's where we can actually trigger. So the CDU is running because it'll just be a part of the life cycle. But look, it's going to run after our update. So check this out. Let's walk through our logs. Constructor ran. Both the renders ran from the parent and child. Component did mount is invoked. We're calling set state here. In fact, I'm going to put calling set state so that we understand why we're getting an update in the update phase. Okay, component did mount invoked, calling set state, renders run again, and then subsequently our buddy updates again. Okay, so we would use this to derive something and make an assumption. Never an assumption. We would make a deterministic cause or case for mounting or not mounting or fetching or not fetching something. So let's trigger this. So let's get a condition that actually will trigger. So if we look at our prev state.pokemon object, for example, and compare it to this.state.pokemon, okay, this one will actually log. And this one will log because, why? Why would this one log? You use set state. We actually have Pokemon in state now. Pokemon is going to equal data. State changed after calling set state. Yep. So this condition will become true because the previous state, which before we go down this road, let's just log what these things look like. I wonder if console.group works in here. Grouping will take all of your subsequent consoles in this function block and group them together in a nice, beautiful, updated way. So console log, we're going to look at prev props, which are going to be null. Or I don't know if they'll necessarily be null. And we're going to look at prev state, or if they'll be just undefined. Okay. Check it out. Yeah, it's just an empty object. It's not undefined. Previous props are just empty object. And then we didn't really get a grouping that makes me happy. It might look better in the actual browser. But look at this. Previous state's an empty array. Okay. Why is it empty? I thought we updated it. I thought we called set state and it updated. Well, remember, we're looking at the previous state. So this would be a reason if you're changing the state or updating things, you don't necessarily, if you want to trigger some sort of network call based on a condition that you set. And we're going to just have to live in this land of a derived sort of example because we're not like building a full application right now. We're just kind of building this little toy example here. Okay. So previous state, that's a very good question, Quentin. Is previous state the initial state? In our case, it is, right? But it will just be the previous state at the time that this was invoked. So this was triggered as a result of us updating the state. So if we did another set state somewhere in some other function, right, then this would get triggered again, and it would be the previous state. But yes, in our case, your assumption is absolutely right. It is the initial state that we're concerned with, right? Because we haven't ever updated it before, and at the time that this gets run, that is the previous state was the initial state. So if previous state.pokemon is not the same as the current or the updated state, then let's log it. So let's take a look. And if you notice, our assumptions are all true about the way that React works. Okay? Can you give us an example of like when you would use component did update in a real world app? Trying to think of times that I have used it personally, and that, yes, okay. So I wanted to build a component that an administrator had certain access to certain features, and a regular user did not have access to those users. So a permissions example. So I would have to check to see if that user had those permissions. And on initial load, okay, the user didn't have, or did have we didn't have the data on initial render. We fetched that data, and then we set it on state. Once it was set on state, I had it. So I could determine which component to mount based on that update, based on that data that came back. Has permissions, mount the portal for the admin. Does not have permissions, they're just a regular user, mount that other screen that pertains to that particular route. Anytime that you're fetching data and that you are conditionally rendering some sort of component based on that data, that's when component did update would be handy. Something like that. Is there a way to log the current state as it stands? So, well, we just derived it from, this would be the current state where it's at. If you ever want to know the current state, the best place to do it would be in your render function. Component did update only runs after set state runs. It runs after any update, but yes, the way to trigger an update would in this case be set state. Let's make sure we look at that rule. Invoked immediately after update occurs. Okay, so it's when do we actually do updates? Set state. So I think it's, Carlos, I'm not going to say 100%. I'm going to point back. I'm not going to say 100%. I can't think of a time where a component would or the state would update or component would update and re-render without calling that set state function. But there's other cases where like it happens because of like Redux or some global state management system. So anytime there's an update that occurs, and in this case, for us, that is directly tied to set state. Maybe as you get more, a bit more sophisticated problems in there. Okay. Okay. Let's drive home. Wonder if we could unmount a component. We could unmount all of those components. We could put a button. Let's see. What's on our Pokemon data? IDs. Okay. I want to get you a will unmount example. Will unmount is the last function. And notice the saddest unmounting phase. It's so sad. It does not have any other friends. It does not have any other items, okay? Component will unmount is a method that will get called when our component is actually leaving the DOM. It really is that simple. Why would one use component will unmount? Who wants to venture a guess? Cleanup? What are we cleaning up? Why would it, what, you got to get a dustpan and a broom out to clean up some components? Ah, there we go. Okay. So yes, the answer to the reasons behind why we would use component will unmount are cleaning up event listeners, subscriptions, those types of things. And yes, we do it to save memory, clear out sensitive data in forms, that type of stuff. Okay. Tatiana brings up another case that I had not considered before right now. Ensuring that another component does not appear on the DOM in the future. Somehow I triggered my breathe app on my watch. And it's like giving me all these haptics telling me to breathe. That was fun. That's a really good point, Tatiana. Just wants me to calm down. I love React too much. Oh my gosh, it's going again. Literally, this is haunting me. Okay, so we don't really need an example for that. Is that pretty straightforward? With the component will unmount, it gets triggered when the component is leaving the screen, when we're unmounting that component, and we do it to clean up any event listeners or help with memory usage, things like that. Get rid of any sensitive information in a user form. These are totally great aspects. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do now for the next 10 or 15 minutes is we're going to play around. We're going to build an app together today from scratch. We're going to open up a code sandbox. We're going to go fetch some data. We're going to use component did mount, which, by the way, of all the other lifecycle methods, constructor, render, component did mount, those three, and then set state is kind of it's part of the updating cycle. Or like there is force update, but we don't really need to talk about that. Any new props that come into the component will trigger re-render as well. But in our case, we have set state, constructor, render, component did mount. If you know and work with those things often, you're going to be just fine in React. The rest of the stuff you would happen upon on a use by use or a case by case basis. Okay, so those are the things that we're going to use to build and construct an app together today. But before that, we want to dive in and show you like a really cool app that Dustin stumbled across. And we want to explore that for just a minute because it's really cool. It's not only really cool, it exposes you to like world like ideas about this. So we're going to take the next 10 minutes and do this. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back, build an app, and then you're going to get out of class early today to get started on your afternoon assignment early. Okay? Sound like a good plan? Timothy asked a really good question. Do we learn a way to unmount with hooks? Or does this happen outside of us calling it? There is a way to unmount with hooks. And I will point you to this article. While we're all, let me get you this URL first. Okay. And then this one. So Timothy, I just dropped an article on use effect. You can look at the last place there. And now I'm going to drop this sandbox. I want y'all to fork it because we're going to play around with it. Earthquake data. It's cool stuff. Brittany, yes, that's fine. Anytime anyone requests a break, I'm all for it. So why don't we take 4 minutes, quick little break, then we'll get back. Cool? We will segment our learning and our projects. Okay, our timer is done. So Virginia asked a really good question that I missed. What do I mean by subscriptions? So like anytime, so there's these things called events, right? Like event handlers in the DOM. And when the events update, you sort of you get a chance to like listen for those updates, just like with the DOM. But in the case that I was talking about would be like subscriptions to external WebSocket style APIs, right? For like a chat app. If, for example, like imagine if you had to, if Slack had to make a post request to get all of the Slack messages every single time somebody posts a message and update that data for you. That would suck. It would be so slow. Slack uses a technology called WebSockets to keep a stream of information alive. And you can subscribe to that stream, and when any update changes, it pushes that update to all of the people using that update. So real-time communication across the web uses what's called a WebSocket. Okay? That's kind of what I was talking about there. WebSocket's one way to achieve that. There's others, but that's like subscription-based information. Cool? All right. Very good question. Okay, so here is a really cool earthquake data application that we are going to sort of just play around with for the next few minutes, and see if we can't just kind of play around and look at it. We don't have to spend long here. We're just really trying to like unpack like a real world application that's built in React. And it's, once again, as with everything, first thing that I like to do is see like what's available to me. So I have this components directory. We have an earthquakes container, a form, which is probably this stuff, right? Earthquake item, probably, I'm not sure what an earthquake item would be, but we could look at it. Ooh, look at this. Constructor, props. They're passing props. We can assume if they're passing props here, what assumptions can we make about earthquakes item if the props are being fed through the constructor and then called by super? It's a child component that relies on data from its parent. So somewhere, based on that assumption, somewhere we have this component defined or being used like this, and then some props are being set on that component, right? That's our assumption. Let's open up the earthquake container component real quick. It's a container component. Ooh, what on earth? What on earth is this? There's no constructor function, but we have a state object. Does it, any question? Any like no mind blown? This, when I first saw this, I was like, this is definitely a mistake. It's that fancy new syntax. It's a new way to write constructor. Doesn't need to say constructor outright. That's cool. Lazy people. What on earth is lack of this? Yeah. So we don't have the constructor function here. This is because it's updated syntax. We could do away with the constructor function, as was mentioned earlier, which I think I brushed over, but I wasn't really understanding what the student was saying about that. Okay. So it's nice. It's nice and clean, a cleaner way to sort of keep your state object here. And the constructor function, which was kind of derived anyway to put classes into JavaScript, is like, we don't even need it. We can just throw in a state object, and now React knows what to do with that state object. Okay? Now, state's an important object to React, so it still treats everything the same. You would initialize state data in here, right? Obviously, it's an empty array. Okay, and then we are going to assume that because it's an empty array, we're going to fetch some sort of data and store it on that Quakes object. Okay, so you can do this. Another thing that you can do, and then they're doing it here, which is funny because they don't need to, is you can use this syntax without using a function declaration or const or an expression, right? You could just method funky syntax here where there's no const before this and they're using arrow functions. It's kind of a new age way of writing React code or class-based code on your methods. Now this will automatically, this component, this, because it's a custom method, not one that comes from extending component, right? In this case, they destructure component so they don't have to say react.component, okay? So because this doesn't come from that, we can use this syntax here and then we don't have to do any funky binding, okay? Because of the lexical scoping behavior of arrow functions. Otherwise, if I had this way, and if I were to write it like this, or even this, watch your typos, folks. If I were to write it this way, well, it doesn't want me to write it that way. It wants me to stick to the other because we're in a class, so this is broken syntax. But yeah, if I were to say class, or sorry, const equals this, then this function, this method, wow, it doesn't even want me to write that syntax. Geez, linter, give me a break. So funky. Okay, so even the new, it won't even let me go back to my old habits because of the linting rules of this code sandbox. Okay, so so writing it this way allows us to just have equal access or regular access to this keyword. Okay. Is there no need for a constructor because it's not a controlled component, does not need props? Yes. That was actually my next point. But I think you can still use the get derived state from props method. In fact, if we were to pass props, we could play around with things. They're not the important things to really understand. The big important things are that there is new syntax. You can clean it up. You can make it nice and user-friendly. You can do this so you don't have to do any of the funky binding that we used to do in React all the time. Cool. Let me catch up on some of these. So it's a cleaner way to hide what we are doing and confuse me. Yeah. That's the problem with teaching React and getting you up to speed on like all of the better practices today, is that they've changed so much in such a short period of time. There's just so much to learn, and you don't have any of the context of months and months and months of React development to go behind these decisions that were made into the API. Okay, we are exposing you to syntax that you will see in various different times of your career. If you get a job using React, you'll see all these different tricks, all these different syntax ways to write things, ways to get things done. So by exposing you to the breadth of it and taking you deep into React for, basically 2 months, and then, getting you to use it during labs, it allows you to have a really firm foundation. So stay with us. I know it's a lot. I know there's changes. I know there's things that are like, what? I thought we just learned this constructor thing, but just know you're going to see this at some point and you're going to be like, wait a minute, Lambda said that we have constructors. Why do we have constructors? And it's going to be that painful moment of like, oh man, my parents didn't ever teach me about this. My instructor. So we're exposing you to all these things so you don't see them in the real world and potentially freak out in an interview or something. Okay. So hopefully, Timothy, that eases the burden that's on your shoulders. And I understand, I've been there. I was a student as well. I've only been coding for, I guess 5 years now, 6 years now. I don't remember where I'm at. But it's been a crazy journey of like diving into this stuff. And I feel the weight. I do. It does slow down. Josh is absolutely right. Okay, wouldn't you need to declare const function or function render method? Yeah. So no, I was looking at methods, not functions within the render function, to answer Will's question. Okay. All right. So notice what they're using component did mount to do here. They're calling a function called fetch quakes. Let's go see. Ooh, they built some services. They're using standard architecture here. And fetch quakes goes, plays the date. Okay, don't really care what that does. It's just really setting bounds for when these earthquakes take place. And then they're using this information. Look here. They're adding information that comes from the user to the API that they're calling. Okay. Now, one thing to note, have y'all done fetch before? Is this syntax familiar to you? Okay. Use it for Axios. Fetch is the built-in JavaScript Axios. There's Axios. I don't want to say it that way, but that's kind of the way to think about it. There's Axios or HTTP requests built into JavaScript, and we can use the fetch function to do that. Okay. Let's go to earthquake maps really quick. Let's see what they're doing. Remember, all we're doing here is just diagnostics. We're just playing around to see how somebody else builds React application. And look, component did update. If previous props.google does not equal the current props.google, or previous props.quakes does not equal the current props.quakes, trigger something. We're going to load the map. So this, here's your real world example of component did update. If these things are not the same, if all things are not equal, or this condition actually holds true, then we're actually going to load the map. Okay. So this is something you can do in your free time. You can source all the code sandboxes that are public and people publish. You can see what people are writing or how they're using these methods and kind of get to understand a little bit about the things that are available to you in the React ecosystem. The best way to like continue your growth and development is to not only apply the things that you learn to your own technical problems that you're trying to solve, but also to look at the ways that people have used the technology to solve problems that they are encountered with. Like this earthquake mapper. Somebody wanted to build this probably to show off or flex their awesome React muscles or to learn something, right? You can do some diagnostics, and just looking at the code will help you sort of derive a way that you can build and craft your code as well. We're all grifters in this community. Every single one of us borrows ideas from everyone else. Okay? There's there's a very small subset of people who are coming up with unique ways to solve problems today, right? The rest of us use the good patterns that we see from other developers. That's me. Okay? I've solved some really cool algorithms in my day, but I don't think I've ever solved a problem that hadn't been solved before me, maybe with some tweaked variables based on the companies that I've worked for and things like that, or some tweaked inputs and different outputs. Okay. Where did we find that earthquake app? So Dustin said that he sourced it and found it through, you can ask Dustin, but you can go to Code Sandbox and you can look and see, here's all this stuff that I've done, but you can see other people's sandboxes somewhere in some land of Code Sandbox. It's kind of like CodePen. Okay, let's build an app together. And then I'm going to answer all of your fetch questions when we get there. What is better, Axios or fetch? I dare you to tweet that. I triple dog dare you to tweet that, and I will retweet it if you just mention me in it. Ryan asked me to tweet this, and then we'll find out from the Twitter community. It's funny. I know I'm saying that like tongue in cheek, but honestly, like, what is better? They both solve the same problem. One is built into JavaScript itself with ES6. The other is a third-party library that some guy who now works for Apple, the beautiful beard, his name's Matt Zabriskie, wrote. Okay, so you can there's benefits and drawbacks to each. I don't have enough information to say this one's better, but let's tweet it. Let's source the Twitters. Okay, let's build an app together. Everyone go to Code Sandbox. Sandbox. And we're going to use a real API. And we're going to build this in 23 minutes. Axios. Yep, tweet me. Tweet quote me and say, Matt Zabriskie, the only reason that your app is amazing is because you have a beautiful beard. Please don't do that. I don't even know if he has a beard anymore. Okay, everyone change this to an H1 that says dogs. We are going to play around with the dogs API. Which one of these should I use? Let's find out. I like this one. I've used this one before. Okay. It's beautiful documentation. We can list all the dogs. Okay. Or we can get a list by breed. Let's go back. That's what we want. We want the breed list. We're going to play with this and check it out. We're going to put boxer right here. And I don't want random. I want all of the boxer images. And then look. Boom. Oh my heck. Oh, that's a good boy. Okay. So we're going to build a dogs app. We're going to fetch these dogs. Whoa. That is awesome. So yeah, create your own sandbox. I'll wait for you to do it. First thing we're going to do, because we need some state, we need access to the lifecycle methods to drive home these parts of the React API. We're going to do what? If we need access to lifecycle methods, we want some state on this app component. We have to do a little bit of converting. We're going to go class app extends react.component. And then we have to render what we want to return to the screen. If you're having bandwidth problems or like just trouble keeping up in general, I'm going to just post this so that I can save as we go. And then I'll just, you can just keep refreshing. If you don't want to like actual fingers on the keys type along, strongly, highly recommend fingers on the keys typing along as you can through this little tutorial. But if you can't, that's fine. We'll allow you to derive everything from this. Okay, so we have our dogs API. We're just going to copy and paste this in for good measure, comment that out, and we're going to put some state on this component. Now I'm going to let you choose how we should do this. Should we use a constructor function or nah? Oh, I have to do a poll. I have to do a poll. I can't put all so this message, yeah or nah. And then you're gonna emote with a thumbs up if you want the constructor function, or pizza if you do not want the constructor function. Okay, you have 30 seconds to finish your votes. We are Okay, looks like constructor function wins. We only had 80 votes, but that's fine. Okay, we're going to use the constructor function. And then down here, below it, oh, what did I forget? Below it, we're going to just say, comment that out. What did I forget? Super. Notice what's awesome about my little linter, my tool telling me what's wrong here, is that it's not allowed before super. Thank you. We would not have access to this keyword without super. We would not have access to this without you super. Okay. So you wouldn't have access to this without that. Super is a part of the constructor function if you're extending any functionality that you need. That's where it goes. Okay, so now our doggos is an empty array. Let's loop over that array. Let's get rid of this h1 for now. Well, we could just wrap it in a div. Div soup. React developers used to write what's called div soup until fragments became a thing. And then we're going to say this.state.doggos.map. We're going to dump. We're going to say for each dog, give me a div whose dog is dog. We're just going to, it's going to be an image actually. But for now, we'll just put a div that says a string dog because we're building. Oh, number one thing you never want to do out of your map function is forget the return keyword. Because it won't break. Now there's linters that'll keep you from that. But this won't break without the return keyword. It just doesn't do anything. And you're just like, why is my stuff not working? Oh, I didn't return anything. So we return, what are we actually returning here? What is this function? It's a map function. What does a map function return? What is it returning? What will it return? An array. It's going to be an array of divs. In our case, it's going to be a single div. But since there's nothing on it, there's no data in that array, we'll worry about it. Okay. Now we need a function that fetches our dogs. Our dogs are not going to fetch. We're going to build a fetch function for them. And we'll just do this. I don't think we need any parameters for it. So we'll just do this. We'll go equals empty, and it'll probably auto format to something. Eventually, we might need a parameter. And then we're going to use our fetch function. This is like Axios. Okay, so this is something new. What do we do when we see something new? We ask questions about it. Besides whether or not it's better than Axios, because I don't have an answer to that. I've already proved that. And we're gonna basically just call for all of our doggos. Okay. Now, one thing that's interesting about the fetch function, we're gonna call for all of our boxers. One thing that's interesting about the fetch function is you have to use a promise twice. Okay. And if there's an error, we just want to console.log that error. Sorry, I know I'm going a little fast, but you need to use .then twice because one of your .thens needs to take the response and format it. That's one thing that's interesting is you don't automatically get JSON out of it. Okay? So, and I'm just going to comment this. First promise resolution is used to format the data. And we're going to format it by returning response.json. And because we return, we can go into the next one. And then our doggos will be what gets returned here. Let's just console.log our doggos, and then I will let you catch up. Ooh, comma, colon. Ooh, the API link. So sorry. Yes. You're not going to break the API again? Ooh, maybe. All of us get rate limited. Bishop asked a good question in the Zoom chat. You can have more than one dot then. Yes. In many cases, you would have a first dot then to do some sort of data formatting or like cleanup of your data, and then whatever you return out of your first then block goes into the next then block, and you can have many then blocks as you want. Whatever gets returned out of them goes into the next subsequent then block. Cool. We're going to log the doggos, but we're not invoking this function anywhere. So if I wanted to invoke this function, where could I invoke it? Where does doggos on line 21 come from? That's a very good question. This could virtually be anything, but this right here will become our doggos and get fed in as the argument to this then block. So this is literally another response from here, but to delineate that it's not the same response, I just called it doggos because that's the type of data that we're dealing with. Does that make sense, Kevin? Thank you. Awesome. Okay, we got some doggos. And it's an array on a message property. So we want to set that on state. So I invoked it here, folks. I invoked it here because render will get called, and I can call a function right after that. Cool. So we have our dogs. Let's put them on state, and then let's render them to the screen, and let's see what happens. First and foremost, they're all images. Okay, that's great. And they're all indexed at 0. So we can use that image as a key. So we're going to call it state right here. And we're going to say doggos. Or, sorry, what is our state? Dang, I should call them dogs. Just this one. Okay, I'm going to call this dogs because we already have a variable named doggos, and I don't want to be confusing. So doggos equals dogs.message. Message. Look, we're printing all these dogs. So now, if I just imagify this, and I say that each key is set equal to dog, and the source for the image equals dog. Hoo-wee! Image elements must have an alt prop. Thank you. Keeping us and our ally partners happy. Look at this. Oh my gosh. Oh no, did we break it? Okay, yeah. I need to scroll a little bit more. Look at this. That guy doesn't look happy though. He looks sad. Alert. Oh, that is a short, that's not a purebred boxer. There's no way that's a purebred boxer. Okay. So I just saved, so you should be able to refresh and get the new changes. Now, this is great and all, but like we're kind of We're kind of using render as an anti-pattern here. Where would we actually want to call our fetch doggos function? Component did mount. Let's do it. In fact, let's put our actual lifecycle methods up above. Okay. Now we're tapping into the life cycle in a positive way. I'm going to just kind of put so we can see more dogs on the screen. Looks a lot better. Ryan, you're late to your appointment. No, I have 8 minutes. Thank you. So what we're going to do before I leave you, though, I didn't want to leave you without something to try and attempt before you go to lunch. You can also get started if you get it done early. Is notice that we're using a URL and we're just hard coding the breed in here. I wonder if this is recognized because I have a short key, but it actually doesn't recognize that. That is so sad. We'll just put Yorkie in here. Oh, it doesn't recognize Yorkie either. Yorkshire Terrier. Boxer's just easy. Labrador. Is that how you spell Labrador? Okay, what we want to do, and this is something that we could play around with, right? We actually want the user to give us some input here. Oh my heck. Oh my heck. You know what that puppy's breath smells like. Puppy breath is all the same. Okay, so this needs to be a variable, right? We want to control this input. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We are going to set a value on state. And we're going to call it dog term or dog search term. Dog breed